Well, first of all, congratulations for finding this room. This is the most challenging room for me to find, and I was in here yesterday, so I guess that's on me for not being able to easily replicate the steps it took me to find this place yesterday. Well, thank you for coming down and joining me today. I do appreciate it. Let's talk about this JavaScript thing, shall we? You know, and as you and I were just discussing, it is a little strange that here we are at a conference that's largely Java focused, and we're filling up a room full of people to talk about JavaScript. What's up with that? But let's be honest, if you're doing a Java project today, if you're doing a web project, you've got some JavaScript mixed in there somewhere, whether you like it or not. And I'm amazed at how many companies or how many teams have decided, you know what, we're just going to do everything in JavaScript. I had a former manager of mine who took over another area, and they decided to go all in on Node. And I was talking to him one day about that. I said, why did you guys decide to do that? And his reasoning, or at least part of his reasoning, was that it was easier for their development team to just deal with JavaScript than it was to go back and forth between JavaScript and C#. Now, I'm not 100% convinced that's the reason why he would go all in on one specific language. I'm not a huge believer in the one language to unite them all theory of development. But it is an interesting way to look at this. And what's fascinating to me is to see this shift that we've had in our industry. This used to be pretty straightforward. We had a JavaScript file likely called main.js. It was 1,000 lines or 1,500 lines or 2,000 lines. We even thought that was excessive at the time. Although I will admit I worked on one project in the very early aughts where our main.js was almost 40,000 lines of code. That was one of those things that just sort of kept growing and growing and growing. And we actually broke it up into multiple pieces. It was a really crude kind of module-esque system just to make it easier for us to do development work because you had so much contention over that file, it made it almost impossible to get anything done. But now you look at where we are today, sitting here in 2018, and you realize that, hey, our applications no longer just have a 1,500-line main.js. JavaScript is no longer this sort of throwaway thing that maybe the intern does or the designer does. It turns out that JavaScript's a first-class citizen today. And if you look at a typical application, certainly the client side of our applications, they might be tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of lines of JavaScript. Now, we don't write that all ourselves. We certainly leverage frameworks and libraries and things like that. Of course, that brings up a whole nother set of interesting problems, as Joe Armstrong shows us in this recent tweet. Thank you for the latest version of your wonderful new program with all these new features. Breaking all the code that worked before is fantastic, and I look forward to the many hours of fun I have in front of me trying to figure out what you broke and how to fix it. Anybody who's gone through the Angular 1 to Angular 2 conversion probably can relate to this tweet. You've probably had some experience with NPM all the things. Isn't that fun? I remember when we used to knock on Maven because, you do like a Maven build and like a third of the internet gets downloaded. And then I started playing around with NPM and I realized that it's basically the same thing. I do an NPM install and about a third of the internet comes down on my laptop. And I'm actually convinced that this is a deliberate thing, that this is like a hot backup of the entire internet. So like any given tech conference, the entire internet exists on all our laptops. So if something happens, it's fine. We can be back up and running in a matter of minutes. But what I think a lot of us have lost sight of here is JavaScript itself continues to evolve. I think so many of us had a really negative experience with JavaScript sometime in the past, whether that was 20 years ago or 15 years ago or 10 years ago. And for a lot of us, our reaction was, never again. That's it. I was burned once. I'm not going down that rabbit hole. And I urge you to take another look at the language today and look at what's going on with ECMAScript 6 and some of the changes that are coming down the pipe. There have been significant improvements to the language. And if you're looking for a real succinct way to get through that, Venkat, who was here earlier today, Venkat Subramaniam, just published a wonderful book kind of walking through what's new in JavaScript. So you owe it to yourself to give JavaScript a second look as far as I'm concerned. Now, I'd like to tell you that browsers have all resolved everything and what you write will work across the board, but I'm sorry, that's just not the case. The struggle continues to be real. And the challenge really is on us, is to sort of deal with that reality. Now your first question might be, well, what do you mean by this whole pipeline thing? What's that all about? Well, first of all, we're no longer dealing with our older sister's web apps here. This is no longer just a few thousand lines of JavaScript with some jQuery mixed in. It's so much more than that. And this sort of ad hoc approach that worked okay 15 years ago, 10 years ago, just doesn't work today when we've got thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of JavaScript. Now, honestly, the prescription here is nothing new. It's just taking that same level of discipline that we traditionally use with our back-end language of choice and bringing that to our front-end code. That's it. And so you've all probably got a linter that runs over your Java code today or something similar, like maybe a PMD or find bugs or something like that. We can do that to JavaScript. Pretty confident you're all writing unit tests. I mean, right? Please tell me you're writing unit tests. Don't make me cry. Right? So that's not a controversial thing anymore. Now we've got a few things that are a little more specific for the front end, like bundlers, so that we don't have to make 75 requests back to our server. And maybe we want to take advantage of some of these new features with browsers that don't understand it yet. So maybe we'll leverage a transpiler to do that. And of course, I'm lazy. I don't want to have to figure out how to do this stuff all by hand every single time. So I'd like to have a task runner come along and sort of make that all a lot easier for me. One little command at the command line, one thing that can get executed by my build server, and away we go. Now, it's important to understand that JavaScript usage has absolutely exploded. This is not a surprise, I guess, but I do think it takes people aback a little bit, especially if I ask a real simple question like, does anybody know what the #1 language is on GitHub right now? What's the most widely used language on our most widely used source code repository? Happens to be, of course, JavaScript. And it's not even close. I mean, it's more than double Python, which is pretty crazy. Now, I mean, this might not be an exact number because, some of the ways it identifies a repo might not be 100% correct. But even if we're off by a few 100,000, this is still makes it the largest language out there, which is pretty darn fascinating. And this is not anything new, by the way. It's been this way for quite some time. You can look at plenty of different ways of sort of identifying language usage, and JavaScript has been near the top for quite a while. The moral of the story for us as developers is we can't treat JavaScript as this one-off thing anymore. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. We can't pretend it's someone else's problem. We have to treat it in the same respect we would with Java or C# or Python or Ruby or whatever language we're using day in, day out. We need to take that same discipline that we routinely apply to our server-side code and apply it to our front-end code. I don't think that's terribly controversial. Now, what I do think is so fascinating is to see for how many organizations JavaScript is the language. They're not using anything else. That's what they use on the front end and on the server side. I think that's pretty interesting. Now, I understand some of the rationale here. I can write, a validation, and I can use it on the server, and I can use the same validation in the browser. I get some of that. Again, I'm not a huge believer in the we should just have one tool option. I don't think that is typically in our best interest. But it does fascinate me how many teams have made this decision that JavaScript, in fact, is my choice across the board. Now, there's a lot of options in this space. JavaScript seems to be a very fertile ground for almost everything. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I don't know if it's just kind of this attitude that, anything you can do, I can do better. I mean, we've certainly seen that periodically in this space. I don't know if it's just because some of these things really are pretty easy to do, and so someone gets bored on a random rainy weekend and decides, I'm going to build one of those and throw it out on the interwebs and see what happens. But my goal with a session like this is to try to kind of run you through some of these various options and point at shiny things along the way and give you some ideas on what might be useful in your world. Now, I'm a big fan of linters just because there's this whole class of problems that we can just solve without us having to do a lot of effort. There's this whole set of things that we traditionally do that can be caught automatically. My favorite example, of course, is equal equal versus equal equal equal. Every single one of us in this room has misused equal equal before, and many of us know better. I mean, I certainly know better. I still forget and put equal equal in there and then slap my forehead when I notice it. It's just one of those things that having this extra automated step to go in and say, hey, you did something kind of silly here, you should probably fix that. So this is just traditional static code analysis, although JavaScript's not really static, so I probably can't call it that. It's maybe a non-runtime view of your code base, perhaps. But the goal here is just to find bad patterns in your code, things that can easily be fixed. Go in, clean this up, keep everything nice and tight. You could also use these kinds of tools for style adherence. That tends to be a bit of a rabbit hole as we start to argue about which style is the one true style to use. I was pairing with a developer once many years ago, and we spent, I swear, the first hour of our time together having him just go through all the files and reformat them to his personal preference, because he just couldn't possibly work with the code unless it was indented the exact way he needed it to be. And I don't honestly remember if he was tabs versus spaces or anything like that, although I guarantee he had a very strong opinion on whichever one he favored. But I thought to myself, man, this is not the best use of our time to simply sit here and reformat a bunch of files. Let's actually go in and fix these problems that we have in front of us. But the beauty of a linter is we can find these basic programmer errors and fix them before they leak out into our code base, before they become widely distributed in our code base as people see these patterns and repeat them. Again, by far the most common one here is going to be equal, equal versus equal, equal, equal. Of course, for those of you that don't know the difference, the first option here is going to use type coercion. And so it'll try to make things work even when they don't. And unfortunately, that will work most of the time. And it will not work at whatever moment is the most worst for you, right? So that seems to be the most typical response. You're giving that demo to the VP or to a founder or something like that, and that's usually when it blows up in your face. Wow, it's worked perfectly for 3 weeks, and now, of course, it decides to break. Those are the kind of things that we can easily find using a linter of choice. I strongly advise you to wire your linter into your IDE or text editor of choice. I would much rather have people notice these mistakes as they are working, as opposed to committing it, checking it in, getting a build break, and realizing, oh wait, I don't really want to go back and fix that, so I'm just going to ignore it. Now, as you will find out throughout the course of our time here together, there are always multiple options in this space, and so with linters in JavaScript, you've got a couple different things to choose from. The big one these days seems to be ESLint. The thing I really dig about ESLint is it is eminently pluggable. Right, so it gives you a lot of control over what rules are going to run. They have a ton of rules. It is almost overwhelming how many rules ESLint has baked in. So you can go to their website and you can literally just scroll through, and you just kind of keep scrolling and you keep scrolling and you keep scrolling and you keep finding all sorts of things. And some have really unique names. Like my personal favorite is Yoda. I'm a Star Wars fan. I grew up on that movie. I cannot tell you how enjoyable it was for me to introduce the Star Wars universe to my child. And I cannot tell you how joyful I am that whole universe has been brought back. And thank you, Disney, I guess, for pumping out a movie every year. Maybe I'll get tired of it eventually, and I'm sure I'll find something to complain about in the future. But I'm just in that happy afterglow of the fact that we're finally getting new movies. I can't wait to see Solo either. By the way, I think that's going to be a lot of fun. So what is Yoda other than one of my favorite little Muppets? Well, require or disallow Yoda conditionals. So that's basically which side do you want your constant on when you're doing an if check. Now, I didn't even realize this was a thing until I started poking around in their documentation. I'm like, I didn't know we had yet another thing to argue about. I'm just curious, do any of you ever put the constant on the other side? And that's kind of my reaction. I've always put it on the right. I've never even thought about putting it on the left. I guess there's really no reason you couldn't. Right? And I actually had a few people now explain to me that, oh no, this is so much more readable when you use, I guess, Yoda style. I thought, all right, well, that's an interesting thing we can debate, I guess, have a passionate conversation about. So we keep going. We get into things on, strict mode, of course, and variables, and there's some Node.js stuff hiding in there. And we go a little further. There's some stylistic issues we could apply if we wanted to. And we just kind of keep scrolling, and we keep scrolling, and we keep scrolling. And it's just like, my God, there's a lot of rules here. And you don't actually have to read all of them if you don't want to. And then you get into some of the ECMAScript 6 specific kinds of stuff. There's a handful of things there. Now, the things that are little check marks, those are going to be on by default, and you get to control what you want to turn on or off from there. The configuration is, as you can probably expect, JSON, so you can tweak this literally to your heart's content. You could also use JavaScript. You could also use YAML, totally up to you, whatever you're most comfortable with. If you run eslint -init, you'll get a .eslint.rc file. I must have missed the memo when the JavaScript community decided to name all configuration files as a .dot file and then throw RC at the end of it. That was a new one for me, but that's everything these days. Seems to be some variant on that. One of the things that's kind of handy about ESLint is you get to decide what the error levels are. So you can decide that something is off, you can decide that something is a warning, you can decide something is an error. It's totally up to you. Again, the recommended rules are the ones that are going to be run by default. That's anything that has a check mark next to it, that green check mark. So as you kind of scroll through the page, you saw a whole bunch of those, obviously. You can also alert ESLint to various environments or global variable type things, that you might be using in your world, so that it won't say, hey, I don't know where this $ thing's coming from. Oh yeah, I'm still using a little jQuery. Just let me do it. There are a bunch of different parser options, which is interesting as well. Now, out of the box, ESLint does expect that you're using ES5 syntax. You can certainly tell it, no, I'm using ES6 or something else if you want to. You also see ESLint used fairly often with JSX. So if you're doing React, there's a pretty good chance that you're using this as well, and you're probably using the ESLint plugin for React as a part of that. The default parser is Esprit. You can certainly use that if you want. You can swap it out if you want. Again, one of the things I really appreciate about ESLint is highly pluggable. You can tweak a whole bunch of different things depending on what your project needs, depending on what makes you happy. So there's a bunch of different third-party plugins you can leverage there. You are free to ignore a chunk of code if you want to. So if you've got some block that just can't pass your rules because you got to do some weird stuff for some strange reason, you can go ahead and put this comment in, disable from here, enable back on at this point. I strongly, strongly advise you to be careful with this. It's very easy for the code inside that block to grow beyond what you intended. It's also very easy for a developer to decide, I know how to get my code to pass all the rules. I'll just put this comment at the top, I'll put this comment at the bottom, and boom, my code passes all the rules there. That saved me a whole bunch of effort. Now, I don't run into that often, but I've seen it enough that I have to give you that warning. So be really, really cautious if you start littering your code base with that comment. You can also disable specific rules inline. I would urge you to be as precise as possible with these kinds of things. So you can actually go in and say, disable this specific rule here, now re-enable that specific rule. If you're going to do any of that kind of tweaking, again, be as surgical as you can in your code base so that you don't inadvertently skip a whole bunch of issues because you use the really broad way of disabling things. And again, the code inside those blocks has a tendency to grow over time. It is possible to turn on all the rules. Possible. So you can just go into configuration and say, give me ESLint all. This is a really bad idea. Don't ever do it. One of the things that ESLint will do and has done is change the rules. And they don't just wait for major versions. Sometimes on minor versions, they will tweak the rule set. So if you want consistency, repeatability, you want to go ahead and configure this the way you want it on your teams. All right, I'll talk more about what rules turn on here in a second. As you can probably guess, this will work with Atom, this will work with Emacs, this will work with Sublime, this will work with TextMate, Vim, etc. It'll work with all our major IDEs as well, from JetBrains all the way down to Visual Studio and everything in between. There are pre-commit hooks that you can use. There is, of course, a command line tool. You can integrate this with Mocha if you wish. There are stock rule sets that work with Angular, stock rule sets that work with Jasmine, with React, etc. If you don't want to configure your own rule set, you can go borrow someone else's. So you can take Airbnbs or Facebooks or Googles or Shopify's, and you can go ahead and then use that as a starting point, or you can just say, heck, we're just going to follow their rules because they probably know what they're doing. That will be just fine with us. Now, ESLint gives you a whole bunch of different integration points. So there's all sorts of different tools that integrate in, and there's actually a curated list called Awesome ESLint that will walk you through all the various things you could possibly add to the mix. As you can probably guess, this is installed via NPM, so you will be part of that hot swappable backup of the internet. It is an MIT licensed product, like so many things are in this space. Now, if you look at ESLint and you're like, you know what, I don't want anything to do with this Yoda rule thing. I'm more of a Star Trek fan. Forget that Star Wars universe. That's totally fine. There are other options. The other major one would be Jeaious Hint. I've used this quite a bit in previous projects. Powerful tool. It's a smaller rule set, but there's still plenty of things in there that you can tweak and turn on and off to your heart's content. Has many of the same features that ESLint has in terms of disabling rules, disabling or ignoring certain blocks of code, things like that. Whatever tool you use, please use a linter. It is amazing to me how many of these common mistakes we routinely inject into our code base. Years ago, at the company I was at the time, we were using a vendor library, and we had one of their architects come in and just kind of do a code review for us. Were we using their library in the most effective way, et cetera, et cetera. And I had a pretty good idea of what that report was going to say because I knew some of the things that team had done that were maybe stretching the boundaries a little bit of the right way to use that tool. But what really disappointed me was how many linting rules we were violating. And so, not surprisingly, the architect ran, a linter against the code base and was pointing to all these mistakes. And I personally felt very bad about that, even though I wasn't involved with the project day in, day out, because I'd given several presentations and I put together, like a set of best practices for that team on, how to do JavaScript right. And here's common mistakes that you should avoid, like equal, equal, equal instead of equal, equal. And sure enough, the code base was littered with equal, equal. And that made me sad because I went through all this effort to try to teach these guys, how to do it right, and they just either weren't listening or maybe I didn't do a very good job explaining it. I don't know. But regardless, they had a whole bunch of these kind of mistakes in their code base. I did reach out to their team lead, their architect. I said, hey, do you want to try to get these things wired into our code base? We've got a lot of these tools in place now. And she never got back to me. So obviously it wasn't a priority for them. So, we'll see how they do in another few years. Now, which one should you use? Totally up to you, right? There's lots of options here. There does feel like there's a bit more energy maybe behind ESLint than Jeaious Hint. Jeaious Hint fundamentally was kind of the follow-on to JSLint, which is kind of the first linting tool we had in the JavaScript space. The only sort of catch maybe with ESLint is there are so many options, right? And so that makes it a little tricky to kind of figure out exactly what setup, what set of rules do you want to apply to your code base. I strongly advise you to spend some time thinking about those configuration options. This should not be something you just sort of willy-nilly pick. You want to sit down with your team, have a discussion, and figure out what makes sense for us, what rules do we really care about, and how do we want to move forward with this. Now, speaking of options, this is something that, again, we need to ponder because we're immediately presented with this problem of which rules do I turn on, which rules do I turn off, how do I handle all of this? Now, there's 3 answers that work for every question you've ever gotten in computer science. There's 42. That's the geek check to see who's well read. Another layer of indirection. That's kind of my go-to as an architect. Well, the answer here is another layer of indirection, of course. But the answer I probably give more often than any is it depends. Right? And I know for a lot of people that's a total cop-out, and I get some grief when I say to people, it depends. But that is really the short answer to almost any question you're ever going to ask me. Now, this shouldn't end the conversation. The response you should have to someone when they say it depends is, well, what does it depend on? That should be that lead-in question then to a deeper conversation about the nuance of this particular space. So when it comes to linters, if you ask me which one should I use or which option should I turn on, well, I'm going to ask a pretty basic follow-up question. What kind of project is this? Has this been around for a while? I mean, I've had some people refer to existing projects as brownfield. I'm not so sure I like that analogy, but I get where it comes from. Or is this brand new? Is this something that, we're just getting off the ground? We haven't even committed our first line of code yet. Now, I will admit it is very tempting in these situations to go in and crank every single knob up to 11. I totally understand that temptation. I've been there. I've tried that. Please don't do that. That's a really bad idea. Right? I remember one of the first Java projects I was on where I brought in, I don't know if it was PMD or Find Bugs, one of the two, but I decided that's it. There's a new sheriff in town. We're going to do it right this time. We're turning on all the rules, even the rules that contradict each other. We'll figure it out. And that just blew up in my face. And with reflection, I completely understand why. Because if you have an existing project that's been around for more than a few minutes, it's got some cruft in it. This is inevitable. This is the second law of thermodynamics. Right? Code is going to devolve if we're not very diligent and very disciplined and keep on top of that. So if I come into a project that has been around for a while and I turn on every single rule, guess what? All I'm going to do is overwhelm my team with warnings. We're going to have thousands, potentially, of warnings, and that is not a good way to get people to write better code. All that does is discourage people because they're like, whoa, man, I didn't know I was such a bad programmer. This doesn't sound like fun. You know how long it would take us to fix all these? This is impossible. And if you run this through your build server, you run this through your CI server, you get this graph that looks like a freaking mountain, and you're like, man, I don't want to climb up that mountain. I mean, have you seen what happens to people that go up there? I mean, people die when they go up that mountain. They just leave the bodies behind. That doesn't sound like fun. I want nothing to do with that. And so people get discouraged, and they look at it and they say, you know what, we've got so many warnings. There's just no point in me even trying to do better. It's a waste of my time, waste of my effort. And even if somebody gets really motivated one day and they spend an afternoon and they crank out 10 or 20 or 30, they're like, oh man, I did really great work this afternoon. I fixed 20 of these things, and they check it in and the line goes down a pixel. And they're like, really? An afternoon's of work results in a pixel? Man, this job sucks. Now, that's a problem in itself. But what worries me more is the fact that it's incredibly easy to miss when we add another one. Our brains are gist machines. We're not good at super precise kinds of things. You know, if I ask you like what time you woke up this morning, you wouldn't tell me exactly down to the millisecond what time you woke up. You know, you probably wouldn't even know, right? It's like, I got up at like 7:30 or something, whatever it was. You know, so our brains, when we're presented with a big number, like say we've got 1,500 warnings, and we add another one, someone says, have we always had like 1,501? Yeah, that sounds about right. And then you add another one and another one and another one, and someone's like, hey, we've got like 1,510. Is that about right? Yeah, I think so. You don't notice that the pile is getting bigger. You know, it's sort of that proverbial, you know, frog in the boiling water, which apparently isn't true, but, you know, it still makes for a fun story. So my advice to you, if you've got an existing project, is start small. Look around, figure out what rules could we turn on, and have a discussion with your team. Get your people together and talk about it. You know, this could be as simple as turning on just 1 or 2 rules. That might be all you can agree to. I've been in some of these conversations, and there can be a lot of passion on both sides. And so if you try to turn on too much, this is going to be problematic. So don't be afraid to just say, okay, we can all agree on the equal thing, right? Okay, let's turn that one rule on as a place to start. Take that single step. And so do that. Turn that on. That hopefully results in a relatively small number of warnings that you can easily fix within the course of an iteration. So do that. And then an iteration or 2 later, turn on another rule, or 2, or 3. Continue to do this. Rinse, repeat over the course of multiple iterations, or as I like to refer to it, ratchet up. And before you know it, you're going to have a really complete set of rules running on your code base, and you're going to have a much cleaner code base to show for it. That's a huge win. Now, I do want to encourage you, though, when you change the rule set, please inform your team of that fact. I've had developers do this, typically, I don't know why, on a Friday afternoon before they're leaving on vacation. What is it about like that pre-vacation period where all our brains like shut off and we're like, I'm just going to make some quick changes and check that in. I'm gone. I turned off my cell phone. Ha, ha, ha. And then they get back and it's like, we don't like you very much. So please don't do that. If you've got a brand new code base, guess what? You can turn on a whole bunch of rules right from the beginning. You can start clean, you can stay clean. That's perfectly reasonable. But again, if you are starting from the proverbial brownfield, start slowly, work your way up to a complete rule set. And guys, don't be afraid to tweak these things over time. Don't be afraid to review that rule set on a regular basis, maybe a couple times a year, just to say, hey, is this still working for us? Are there some new rules we should turn on? Do we want to maybe turn off some of these rules? Let's go look at somebody else's rule set and kind of compare and contrast. And keep in mind, guys, the warnings are there to help you, not to hurt you. You know, this isn't a punishment. The idea here is, hey, let's just remind ourselves of some of these common pitfalls that happen in any programming language. Now, once you've got a linter introduced, we can start talking about testing. And I hope this isn't controversial to say that we need to test our code. If it is, again, I'm going to be very, very sad. I hope all of you are typically writing lots of unit tests. Now, we can have a really fascinating debate about unit tests versus integration tests versus UI tests. And, you know, I've been involved in lots of these in my career. And my default answer now is yes, you need all of them. You know, the exact way you want to put those sliders is up to you. It's up to what you think makes the most sense, what gives you the most confidence in your code. I'm a big fan of this sort of pyramid model. This has been discovered by multiple people. You know, Mike Cohen was the one I first heard about it from. So, you know, I'm a big fan of that idea. You know, I got a nice big base of unit tests with some integration tests on top of that, with some UI tests on top of that. Now, not surprisingly, there are multiple testing tools that we can possibly use in the JavaScript space. One of the most popular is Mocha. I will admit I have a very soft spot in my heart for this particular tool because my favorite espresso-based beverage is indeed a Mocha. So that gives me a personal affinity to this tool. Good choice on naming. Very popular JavaScript testing tool. I would actually consider it a meta tool because it allows you to pick the assert library. So you can use pretty much whatever you want. If you want to do BDD style testing, awesome. You got a couple different choices there. You prefer assert-based testing, that's fine. You can do that as well. It does have code coverage baked in, although you can use Istanbul as another option for code coverage. It will give you some information about your tests. It will actually highlight, hey, this test is running kind of slowly. You might want to try to tweak that. There's a little bit of static analysis-y stuff in there too. It will look for globals, etc. You can actually run your test based on a regular expression. Of course, you all know what happens then. Now you've got two problems to deal with. There are a bunch of different reporting mechanisms that you can use. There's .matrix, there's TAP, there's JSON, there's landing strip, etc. You can get that coverage report out as either JSON or HTML, so you can wire that into your build if you want to. Again, this is really an interface that supports multiple testing DSLs, and it lets you choose which DSL you think is most appropriate. So you could use should, you could use expect, you could use chai, whatever makes you happy. It is very common to use chai with Mocha. That is confusing our beverage options a little bit, since now we're talking about like a tea mocha. But again, you do you. I'm pretty confident that a Starbucks or something like that will happily create that concoction if you ask. So this is chai. It's really just another assertion library. Very, very common to see that mixed in with Mocha. Not a requirement. It's not a hard thing, but I certainly have seen plenty of people do it. One of the big benefits of Mocha is it allows you to do BDD style testing or TDD style testing, completely up to you. There is support baked in for asynchronous testing right out of the box. You can set various timeouts at either the test or the suite level. Now, by default, Mocha expects anything that's a JavaScript file in your test folder, it owns it. There's some configuration options there, but that's the default anyway. It does use Sinon for spies, stubs, and mocks. Again, you can use Sinon with other tools as well. There's not a hard dependency there. If you want to do headless testing in the browser, you can use Phantom, although again, there's no hard dependency. You can use that with other tools as well. Basically, it's everything you would expect out of any modern day testing library. Now, if you look at Mocha and you're like, I don't really like coffee, which, we should talk about that, first of all. That seems odd, but it's fine. It's a unique universe. If you don't like Mocha, you can use Jasmine. All right, so Jasmine's another very popular testing tool in this world. I don't really have strong opinions either way, to be brutally honest with you. Typically in my role as an architect, I have found trying to dictate tools as a losing battle, and so I just don't want to do that. I am much more interested in my teams writing tests than I am in what tool they write them in. And so at the end of the day, I care a lot more that you are writing tests than you're using my preferred tool. So quite honestly, it doesn't really matter which one of these you use. It's just important that you use something. Now, you will find passionate opinions on both sides of this coin. I was talking with a friend of mine a few years ago. I said, hey, Mocha versus Jasmine, which one do you prefer? And he said, it depends. I said, that's a cop-out. I want a real answer. He said, yeah, but I learned it from you. I'm like, okay, fair. I said, all right, well what do you think? What do you like? He says, well, if I start a project with Mocha, by the time I'm done, I wish I'd used Jasmine. Oh, okay, so you prefer Jasmine? Nope. If I start a project with Jasmine, by the time I'm done, I wish I'd used Mocha. I'm like, well, you really haven't helped me. And he says, you're welcome. There are a lot of passionate opinions here for sure. When I joined Pivotal, I assumed that someone in labs would set me straight on this. And I was talking to one of my peers and I said, so Mocha versus Jasmine, where do people come down? And her response was, yeah, pretty much 50-50. She's like, we could bring 4 pivots in here and you'd get 2 on each side. I'm like, well, that doesn't help. And she's like, yeah. So honestly, guys, it's really a personal decision. Which tool do you like best? And again, I'm agnostic. I don't really care. I've had teams that loved Jasmine, and I couldn't pry it from their cold, dead hands. I had other teams that were like, nope, we're all about Mocha. And again, there's no point in trying to fight that battle. Just use the one that you like best. Use the one that your team likes best, and write some freaking tests. Now, once we have some tests written and we've got some linting going on, now we need to start thinking about what's our code look like at runtime. How does this actually get consumed in the browser? And so the idea here is, well, instead of having lots and lots of files, let's use a bundler to generate one big bundle file or one giant unified JavaScript file. So all our code, all our frameworks, all our dependencies, one ginormous file, so that we only have to download that one instead of going back to the server hundreds of times potentially. Now you might ask yourself, why do I even need to use this? My Java code doesn't work that way. Well, first, let's understand a bit of our history. Very, very common in our world to leverage modules or packages or namespaces, or call it what you like. This is not new. It's just a pattern that we've used since the beginning of computing. Now, some languages actually have a first-class concept for this. Java has the package system, right? In a lot of other languages, it's either non-existent or an incredibly fuzzy thing. all it boils down to is how do we encapsulate some code and how do we sort of abstract this functionality away into a library or a framework that we can easily reuse. Now, ES5 and predecessors had no concept of modules, and that was okay when all we were doing was a few thousand lines of JavaScript. But look around today, and all of a sudden this is starting to fall over. Now, you've probably run into one of two patterns in older JavaScript. There's the immediately invoked function expression, or I guess you'd pronounce that ify or something like that, which just says, wrap a function in parentheses, make it a function expression, and then immediately call it. Imagine that. Now, I know the first time I looked at this, I thought, oh, we're trying to do Lisp. Okay, makes sense. And of course, Crockford has referred to JavaScript as Lisp in C clothing, so, maybe, fine. And that worked because, now our code is encapsulated, so any variable that's inside that function stays within that function's closure. That's kind of a win for us, but we don't really get any dependency management out of that, though. That's kind of unfortunate. Now, that wasn't the only pattern you were likely to encounter in JavaScript code. A lot of people also used the revealing module pattern, which was very, very similar, except we just assigned a return value. So then you could use that to access the module's API, as it were. So we'd have our little immediately invoked piece, so to speak, and we'd just say, okay, return this pointer essentially to that function that we called up there, and now I can change that functionality to heart's content, and you don't have to worry about it because you're accessing it through that API I've exposed on that my module concept. Right? So same basic concept, same benefits, same drawbacks, etc. Now, developers looked at that and said, well, that's not enough. I need an actual module format. And so we started to see various things pop up. There was asynchronous module definition, or AMD. There was common.js. There was universal module definition, or UMD, system.register, etc. And of course, ES6 now does have a module format. So the idea here is let's execute those module loaders at runtime, which is kind of slick because now I can just put one little require or include like statement in my JavaScript, and all of a sudden the loader knows how to go get all that stuff. And there's only one thing for me to deal with as a developer. But then I actually look at the output in my debugger and realize, oh, wow, I just downloaded dozens or hundreds of files. I remember when I was playing with Dojo, this was a very common thing to run into. All I did was include calendar, and boy, that was super easy for me. And then I looked at the output in my browser and realized it went back to the server and asked for another 87 files, including things like circle and square and triangle. And I'm like, what does that have to do with calendar? Dependency management turns out is hard, right? There's no getting around it. And a lot of us, it's like, it works. Don't breathe on it. I don't know why we had to include it, but it's fine. Just let it go. Don't worry about it. Now, Requirejs System.js, very popular in this space. The bundler basically replaces the loader, though, and says, don't bother with that. We'll create one ginormous file that we can then just download, and you don't have to worry about going back to the server a bunch of times. And of course, there are multiple options. So you've got Webpack, which is, as you can guess, a module bundler, which is cool because it'll walk your graph and basically pull in everything that is necessary and then build one giant file out of that. What makes Webpack very cool is it is highly, highly configurable. So you've got four core concepts. There's entry, output, loaders, and plugins. So entry, as you can probably deduce, is where would you like me to start walking your tree? And based on that, I'm going to figure out what your dependencies are and figure out what their dependencies are and their dependencies until we get to the leaf nodes. You can have multiple entry points if you want to. Output, as you can probably guess, where would you like that bundle to go? What would you like it called? This will sometimes be referred to as emitted, produced, or discharged. I suppose if you're snarky, you could say it was excreted if you want to be that way. Loaders are an opportunity for you to extend Webpack. So you can say, you know what, I would also like some other files to have the same treatment, even though they're not JavaScript. Is that okay? Basically, what it allows you to do is turn any file into a module that can be loaded or included. And all you're basically going to say is anything that passed this test should be transformed with this loader. Plugins are an extension point for Webpack, so this is where you can bake in additional steps like minification, optimization, inject variables, things like that. All you have to do is say, I need this plugin, here's the configuration for it, and away you go. There's a bunch of things baked in, and as you can probably guess, there are a whole bunch of other things that you can add on if you want to. Now, Webpack will do a little bit of transpiling. I'll talk about that more here in a second. And fundamentally, what it's designed to do is give us import and export support. Now, the big downside of bundling is it breaks our familiar edit, save, refresh lifecycle. This is one of the best things about web development is I can make a change, hit save, hit refresh, and see if that worked. It's a pretty nice experience. Now, there are ways of getting that concept back, even with the bundlers. And we can also use source maps to figure out, all right, so this is what I'm seeing in my browser. What does that actually map to in this sort of disassembled files that exist on my system? Because otherwise, you're just sort of shooting blind, trying to translate between line 597 of your giant bundle into any of your JavaScript files. There is a watch mode that you can use as well. This is very handy. So when a file changes, it says, oh, okay, you want me to run the build again? I'll go ahead and do that. And then all you have to do is refresh your browser. Although, let's be honest, if you've done any web development, you've probably hit refresh tens of thousands of times. And anything you do more than once, you probably should automate away. So the lazy developer ethos says, you know what, let's go ahead and do that. And so you can bring in the Webpack dev server, which will actually give us live reloading. So now I make a change, I hit save, and the bundle builds, and it automatically gets injected into my browser. That's pretty slick. I don't even have to hit refresh. Lazy developer for the win. This also supports hot module replacement, HMR. You can check the development guide for all the setup work, etc. You can install this from NPM or Yarn. It is also MIT licensed. And as you can probably guess, there are other options. Who could have possibly predicted that? There's also Browserify. Clearly, this was a Harry Potter fan because that looks an awful lot like the Sorting Hat, if you ask me. Similar concepts, similar ideas, gets you to a similar place, just in a slightly different way. Now, the next step here is transpilers. And I know I've said this word a couple times. I don't particularly care for it. It's not my favorite term in our industry. And quite frankly, this is not a new idea. It's just a way of saying I want to do source-to-source compiling. So it is very prevalent in the front-end space. I'm not entirely sure why. I guess we can blame GWT and CoffeeScript for a lot of this. It's that attitude that I just don't want to write JavaScript. Please let me write literally any other language but JavaScript. So in GWT's case, take my Java and turn it into JavaScript. Now that's definitely an instance where we're doing excretion. In our case, where this is particularly useful is take my ES6 code and run it in older browsers that don't know what ES6 is yet. Although you also see people use this because they want to write in TypeScript or they want to write in ClojureScript, etc. This is a very, very common thing, quite frankly. Now, again, where I think this is beneficial to us is how can we leverage modern approaches without having to worry about every single browser under the sun? I, for one, still have nightmares about the IE versus Netscape wars of my youth. This was not a lot of fun, quite frankly, and I still remember my poor CSS designer spent seemingly months trying to get things to look the same in IE and Netscape, and he'd have them up side by side, and he's like, well, it's a goldenrod here, but it's more of a haystack over there. And one day I just looked at him, I said, you do realize you were like the only human that's actually going to bring them up side by side and nitpick like that, right? And he didn't appreciate that comment, so apparently I hit a nerve. I know this is a little maybe too soon for some of you, and things have improved, but not maybe as much as we would have liked. I mean, if you look at a modern sort of, where are we at with features, there's a lot of red still. But the idea here is give us tomorrow's JavaScript today, and that's where Babel comes into the picture. So now I can write in modern JavaScript without having to worry about every browser supporting it. And again, I don't know that we're ever going to have universal browser support, so we're probably always going to need some shim layer like this, or we have to go lowest common denominator, I guess. So the idea here is do some syntax transformation. This is also very common to see in the polyfill, JSX, and Flow worlds as well. You can use plugins to piece together a whole bunch of different transformations. Now, of course, you run into that same problem I touched on earlier. How do I debug when my browser is running something different than what I wrote? Well, that's where, again, source maps come into play. If you want to see what this would do to your code, you can use the REPL on their website. They've actually got a place where you can just paste in whatever new fancy JavaScript code you want to write. Like I'm going to make a coffee drink constructor, and then I can see what does that translate into. Oh, yeah, one of those fun function approaches. Well, I guess I knew that was there under the covers anyway. I can say, but clearly, I'm going to use these new fancy lets because, that sounds like Lisp. That sounds like fun. And then you realize, it's just going to become a var anyway. So there you go. Now, obviously, this is not the way you're going to want to transform your code. You'll want to use the CLI, and you're going to want to wire that into your build of choice. There's a pretty darn good chance whatever you're using, it is indeed supported. There is, of course, a .babel RC file. No one could have predicted this. If you're using React, I can almost guarantee you're using Babel, and you're probably using the Babel preset React as well. This will work with Atom, this will work with Sublime, this will work with Visual Studio, WebStorm, etc. Installed via NPM, it is an MIT licensed option. There are other options, but typically this is how do I transform some other language into JavaScript? So, things like Haste and Elm and Amber and TypeScript and Dart and all that kind of fun stuff. Now, I want to wire this all together because I don't want to have to go to the command line and remember every single one of these. That's just silly. And of course, I want my build to be able to run these things too. So I don't want to do that by hand. That would be painful. Automation is your friend because automation ensures that I'm going to do the exact same thing every single time. I'm going to run my test. I'm going to minify. I'm going to lint. I'm going to bundle, etc. Now, there's nothing new here. You all are using some kind of build tool on your server-side language of choice. Maybe that's Rake, maybe that's Ant, maybe that's Gradle, maybe that's something else. There's all sorts of different options here. It is a very, very fertile space. I know more than a few people who use NPM scripts, so there's a bunch of different stages that you can use. So I can just actually create my own if I want. I can say npm run foo, and then whatever I've got inside that foo block will get executed. And honestly, you can do a lot here. The advantage of NPM scripts, it's one less thing you have to install, update, learn, etc. Although I would argue this is a bit more of an artisanal approach, which might be fine, especially if you're a hipster. There are full-fledged build tools like Gulp. Now, Gulp came along after Grunt and sort of learned from some of Grunt's shortcomings. It is an alternative approach. The goal here is code over configuration. I would argue Gulp is more Gradle-like in its approach, whereas Grunt is more Ant-like in its approach. There is a pretty solid ecosystem here. It is nowhere near as large as what Grunt has, or had. I guess Grunt's sort of kind of dying. Gulp considers itself the streaming build system in that it uses node streams, which can be challenging. That's something to keep in mind. A lot of people refer to streams as Node's best idea and its most misunderstood idea. Honestly, if you're kind of used to a sort of reactive programming model, it's similar in the sense that this is just a big collection of data. It might not all fit into memory. I would argue that's only part of the picture. Frankly, this is a lot like the Unix system where we take a bunch of small tools, we wire them together to get more complicated output by piping things together. That's pretty darn powerful. That's really what I would say at the heart of this. Now again, streams are very common in the Node world. You see this in lots of places. Gulp takes advantage of that largely so that it goes faster. All right, but the learning curve is steep. Do not underestimate that. Right now, if you've been doing Node for 3, 4, 5 years, it's probably not insurmountable, but their documentation could definitely be improved. Also MIT licensed. If you don't like that, guess what? There's other options. Everybody gets a build tool these days. There's Broccoli, there's Brunch, there's Grunt. There are a few others, although quite honestly, many of them seem to be largely abandoned. I think it was like somebody got bored, threw one out there, and then forgot about it. As far as I know, someone published one earlier today. It wouldn't surprise me in the least. So how do I string this all together? I've talked about a bunch of different tools, which should lead you to a very natural next question, which is, which one should I use? Can anyone predict what I'm going to say next? It depends. All right? Now, first and foremost, if you don't like something I've shown you, I am not going to be offended by that in the least. My goal is for you to be a happy developer and have a long, successful career and write great code. If you use the exact same tool set I do, great. If you use a different set of tools, that's awesome. This is very individual, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. You should use what works best for you and your team. If you are unsure what works best for you and your team, do an evaluation. Give yourself a couple hours, a couple days, whatever you think is necessary. Walk your way through these tools and figure out the ones you like best. Please use something. We're writing far too much JavaScript code these days to just fling it at the wall and hope it works. Now, understand this is a very volatile space. There's lots of things changing. That comes with the territory. I urge you to stop treating JavaScript like a toy language. It is not. It is a very powerful language. It seems to be the one language no one feels like they have to learn. I don't quite understand that. I'll just Google and copy and paste and it'll work, right? We wouldn't do that with Java. We wouldn't do that with C#. We wouldn't do that with hardly any other language, and we feel like that's how we should approach JavaScript. I'm not advising you to try to adopt every single one of these when you go back to your office next week. All right? My advice to you is pick something that hurts, pick a tool that will help with that, get it into your process, get everybody comfortable to get people used to it, and then add another one, and then add another one, and then add another one. And over time, you come back here next year, and guess what? You're going to have a pretty strong set of tools running against your code, and you'll have gotten there organically, naturally over time. I strongly advise you to wire all of these into your editor or IDE of choice. I strongly advise you to make the right thing to do the easy thing to do. Now, some projects have tried to go the other direction and say, we're not messing with any of this. I'm writing plain vanilla JavaScript, and that's it. And that can be done, but I'm not 100% convinced that's going to support every single one of your needs. My advice to you is do what is right. Now, at the end of the day, we've come an awfully long way in this space. And it's been very fascinating for me to watch this evolution over the last couple of decades. And we sit here at a point where, convenient or not, whether we like it or not, JavaScript is, in fact, a first-class citizen. We have tools today. What we no longer have are excuses. I wish you luck. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time and attention today.